President Donald Trump issued one of his strongest warnings yet to the Iranian regime on Sunday, declaring that Tehran appears to be edging closer to crossing American red lines amid reports of mass civilian deaths and a widening government crackdown on nationwide protests. Speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One as he traveled from Palm Beach, Florida, back to Washington, D.C., Trump emphasized that his administration is monitoring the situation in Iran closely and weighing what he described as very strong options should the violence continue or escalate further. The president's remarks came against the backdrop of mounting unrest across Iran, where demonstrators have filled the streets in hundreds of cities, challenging the authority of the Islamic Republic in what activists describe as the most widespread anti-government uprising in years. When asked directly whether Iran had crossed a threshold that would trigger U.S. action, Trump responded cautiously but unmistakably. "They're starting to, it looks like," Trump said, referencing reports that civilians had been killed during the government's efforts to suppress demonstrations. "There seem to be some people killed that aren't supposed to be killed." The president went on to criticize Iran's ruling authorities, questioning their legitimacy and condemning what he described as rule by force rather than by consent. "These are violent people," Trump said. "If you want to call them leaders, I don't know. They rule through violence. And we're looking at some very strong options. We'll make a determination." According to Trump, the White House is receiving frequent intelligence briefings, sometimes hourly, on developments inside Iran. He said final decisions would depend on how the situation unfolds in the coming days. Trump noted that initial information suggested some demonstrators were killed during chaotic stampedes as crowds surged through city streets, while others were reportedly shot by security forces. Although the Iranian government has not released comprehensive casualty figures, human rights organizations and opposition groups claim the death toll continues to rise rapidly. Activists cited by international media outlets allege that hundreds of protesters have already been killed since demonstrations erupted more than 2 weeks ago. These claims, while difficult to independently verify due to Iran's tight restrictions on media and internet access, have been echoed by multiple watchdog organizations. By the weekend, demonstrations had reportedly reached at least 190 cities and towns across Iran, signaling a scale of unrest rarely seen in recent years. What began as localized protests quickly evolved into coordinated nationwide demonstrations, with chants and slogans increasingly directed at the core institutions of the Islamic Republic. Opposition groups say protesters include students, laborers, professionals, women's rights activists, and even some former supporters of the regime, suggesting deep dissatisfaction that cuts across social and economic lines. Trump acknowledged the expanding scope of the unrest, suggesting that the situation may be slipping beyond the regime's control. "Iran's in big trouble," the president said in earlier remarks. "It looks to me like the people are taking over certain cities that nobody thought were really possible just a few weeks ago." While Trump declined to outline specific military or diplomatic actions under consideration, he made clear that any U.S. response would not necessarily involve deploying American troops. "We'll be hitting them very hard where it hurts," Trump said, "and that doesn't mean boots on the ground, but it means hitting them very, very hard where it hurts." The statement appeared designed to reassure both domestic audiences wary of another Middle East war and international allies concerned about regional escalation. Military analysts note that such language often points to economic sanctions, cyber operations, targeted strikes, or covert actions, rather than full-scale military intervention. Iranian officials reacted sharply to Trump's comments, warning the United States against any attempt to intervene in the country's internal affairs. State-affiliated media outlets reported that Iranian leaders warned the U.S. military and Israel would be considered legitimate targets if Washington intervened to protect protesters or destabilize the regime. Such statements reflect Tehran's long-standing strategy of deterrence, which relies on threats against American interests and regional allies to discourage foreign involvement. One of the most striking developments during the unrest has been the re-emergence of Iran's exiled Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, as a unifying symbol for some demonstrators. Images circulating online show protesters holding photos of Pahlavi, whose father was overthrown during the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Though Pahlavi himself does not call for the restoration of monarchy, he has urged international leaders, including Trump, to support the Iranian people's push for freedom. In recent statements, Pahlavi described the regime as being very close to collapsing and called on the global community to stand with protesters rather than negotiate with Tehran's rulers. According to U.S.-based human rights organizations, at least 544 people have reportedly been killed since the protests began, with fears that the actual number may be significantly higher. The human rights activist news agency, which has tracked unrest in Iran for years, claims that the majority of those killed were unarmed protesters, while dozens of security personnel also died in clashes. The organization reported that more than 10,600 people have been detained, many without formal charges, as authorities carry out mass arrests in an attempt to crush the movement. International observers note that such detention campaigns often involve harsh interrogations, prolonged solitary confinement, and closed-door trials. As protests intensify, Iranian authorities imposed a sweeping internet blackout, dramatically limiting access to social media platforms, messaging apps, and internet news sites. The blackout has made it increasingly difficult for protesters to organize and for the outside world to obtain accurate, real-time information about conditions inside the country. Rights groups argue that cutting off internet access is a deliberate tactic used by authoritarian regimes to suppress dissent and conceal abuses. The Trump administration now faces a delicate balancing act, applying pressure on Tehran without triggering a broader regional conflict. Supporters of a tougher approach argue that the U.S. has a moral obligation to stand with Iranian protesters and punish those responsible for human rights abuses.
Critics, however, warn that overt American involvement could allow the regime to frame the protests as foreign-backed, potentially undermining their legitimacy inside Iran. Trump appeared aware of these competing concerns, emphasizing that decisions would be guided by facts on the ground rather than emotion. "We'll see what happens," he said. "We're watching it very carefully." For many analysts, the current unrest represents one of the most serious challenges the Islamic Republic has faced in decades. Economic hardship, corruption, and long-standing grievances have converged with a new generation that appears less fearful of repression and more connected to the outside world. Whether the protests lead to reform, regime change, or a harsher authoritarian crackdown remains uncertain. What is clear is that Iran has entered a volatile period with far-reaching implications for regional stability and U.S. foreign policy. As Trump warned Sunday, the coming days may determine whether Tehran pulls back or crosses a line from which it cannot easily return.